Woo, and welcome everyone to Rock M Radio. This is the beginning of a brand new episode of Dive Cuts, and we are live on YouTube for Rock M Plus subscribers. It's season 8 already. We're here to talk about your Missouri basketball Tigers as the only podcast strictly talking about the Mizzou basketball Tigers. I'm your host, Sam Snelling. Watching on YouTube, please give us a like and subscribe and all that kind of stuff if you haven't already. It will help us grow the channel a little bit. I'm the guy on the left currently talking. If you're watching on YouTube, you'll notice though that the dude on the right is not Matt Harris. Matt Harris is in Switzerland right now, running away to the neutral Swiss, and in his stead, Mr. Matt Watkins. How are you, Matt?
Doing good. How are you?
I've had a long day. It's been a long day. Looks like you got a little sunburn. You got a little time out in the sun, playing some golf and taking in some rays and burning that lily white skin.
It's early golf season, so it's a little bit red. It gets a little bit more brown as the summer goes along. But yeah, it's a delicate balance of protecting your skin, but also building up its tolerance to sun for a long summer outdoors.
Yeah, I kind of work the same way. The initial kind of sunscreen, all it does is it gives me like a little bit of a reddish hue, and then things kind of darken a bit. But I'm a pasty kind of English boy, English Irish. I don't really get super tan, so this is I've got the warm light on right now to make it appear a little bit better. Let's talk Tigers. It has been a little while. We had a little bit of a scheduling snafu a couple weeks ago, and rather than just go right on top of before the box score and their normal scheduling, we opted to just punt for the week. And so we're back. We're going to talk about what's kind of happened since then. So the last time that we convened, Mizzou had added pretty much everybody that is on the roster right now, save for one guy. And the guy who we haven't yet talked about is Jaden Stone, who is, I guess, via West Virginia, via Detroit, via Grand Canyon. He's a 6'5" Aussie kind of wing type. He's a guy that I don't think anybody is going to jump out of their seat with the acquisition of, but considering everything that Missouri had done up to this point this offseason, adding sort of a significant piece to sort of take away minutes from some of the younger guys who I think we all like a lot, didn't seem like it was something that was on the table. Watkins, what were your initial thoughts when Stone kind of came across the timeline there?
It kind of fits, with how the spring portal season was going. Mizzou wasn't involved with a lot of the bigger names, and then once you add in Sean Phillips, Sebastian Mack, Javon Porter to a lesser extent, you realize that they had their sights set on something more specific, not best player available so much as just kind of a combo guard wing that would come in, be able to play a little bit, give you some solidity there in the rotation. I think that's what they got. I'll admit when I look at his numbers, I'm not overly blown away. And I think the three of us probably share that opinion based on our conversations. But the one thing, well, there's two things. The first thing that you have to give some deference to is Dennis Gates getting guys that have played in the Horizon League that, for the most part, have all left us with the same opinion, whether that's Dre Golston or even Marquez Warwick last year. It's like, I see what they're doing. I'm just really not sure how good he can be. Those guys both were better than we expected them to be. And that's setting aside Demoy Hodge and Trey Gomillion, who came over with Dennis Gates, which is a little bit different, but still Horizon League players. So, he's 2 for 2 on guys that we weren't really wild on being better than we expected. So you have that going for him. And then second of all, he's pretty good size for a guard-ish type guy, decent athleticism, but, he played on a really, really, really horrendous Detroit team 2 years ago, and his usage rate was north of 30%. And when you're talking about that, you're talking about a guy who's absorbing a lot of possessions. And, those are the types of guys that you can mold into what you want to be a little bit easier than a guy like, say, Jacob Cruz. Jacob Cruz had better numbers than Jaden Stone, at least efficiency numbers, but his usage was more around 21, 22%. So you can't really cut out too much of his possessions to still be a good player. Whereas with Stone, you have a pretty good opportunity to lop off a lot of that's not needed and wasn't very good, and mold him into a little bit better of a player. How well that works out, we don't know, but he played last year at West Virginia and missed the entire season with some sort of neck or head injury, which is a concern since he didn't play at all, and has had a pretty sordid history as far as staying on the court. I think he's played more than half the games in one season at Detroit. So there's some question marks, but when you look at getting into May and the options aren't great, your budget is limited, your role is limited, I think it's fine. That's a long way of saying it's fine.
So it is one of those situations where you are putting faith in the coaching staff, taking a guy who, has sort of at the least proven himself to be a pretty good shot maker. Finding what shots he's better at making and getting rid of, like you were kind of saying, getting rid of the junk. Things that make him less efficient. I'm always leery of taking guys that were on bad teams, or at least successful on bad teams. West Virginia was a pretty good team last year, but he didn't play. 2 years ago, being on Detroit, I mean, like, somebody has to make those shots, right? Somebody has to take those shots. It's always the argument, Missouri has had a lot of bad years recently. And one of the things that we've always talked about is like when guys would leave, and even if you saw like a guy that had potential, it's like, well, he was also, a prominent member of a bad team. And when you're talking about reforming and being a good team, you aren't always concerned about losing guys who weren't helpful towards winning. And I think like that's the big thing for me, is can he contribute to winning? That's going to be the question that the coaching staff and Jaden have to answer. He's got the size, he's got the shot making ability. I think he's reasonably athletic. I think, positionally he'll be fine. All those things. But how are you impacting winning? And are you able to impact winning at a greater rate, than guys who we think are going to be able to impact winning? And that's guys like, Honor Boateng, and even like Jacob Cruz, who's probably, going to play a good amount on the wing. Cruz, we know what you're going to get from Cruz. You're going to get a decent shooter. You're going to get, positional size, a guy who can help stretch the floor. Guys a little softer defensively. Can Stone turn himself into being a better defender? Can he sort of match the shot making of Cruz? Then I think you're kind of working with something there. I do think this is a situation where, there's a lot of the Dre Golston, comparisons, because if you go back to, Golston, I mean, he was a good player on a really bad team. He came to Missouri, and I think we all thought that he was probably going to play, but it was going to be a limited role, because Isaiah Mosley was a guy who was, very likely to step in and provide more of the scoring punch. And that didn't really happen. And Golston was still able to kind of step in, sort of hone his offensive game. And I mean, we have very fond memories of Dre, mostly because he hit some really huge shots. But his efficiency metrics on that team were were fine. Like they
Fine.
weren't bad. Coming from the Horizon, what he was doing, his last year before getting to Missouri, he got a lot better considering he's stepping up in the SEC. But it's still like a guy. I just pulled it up because I was curious. 101 offensive rating. Was Golston his senior year, 57% of the minutes. I would just say, like, I would be surprised if Stone sees 57% of the minutes. I think Stone is probably more likely to see what is equal to or less than what Warwick provided. If he becomes a defensive menace and a guy who, can hit 35 to 40% of his threes, and I think you're going to see him on the floor a little bit more. But we don't necessarily have a ton of evidence that he's that guy right now. So leave the door open. Like to leave the door open for anything here. But certainly not a guy who I would, like as we kind of get into the offseason, we do our little fun top 8 exercise. Not a guy that I would really expect to kind of hit top 8.
Yeah, that's one of those weird things that when I look at his numbers, I wouldn't either. But
Knowing Dennis,
just the Dennis Gates factor. Not that it's bad, but these guys that he pulls in from the Horizon tend to surprise a little bit. I mean, Marquez Warwick actually finished a little bit lower in minutes than I anticipated, but I gave Warwick that artificial bump, expecting him to be higher. But Warwick was good last year. He was an efficient player. He probably should have been used a little bit more when he was on the court. But I mean, when he came on there, he had a positive impact offensively. Defensively, he was.
Well, if Stone wants to shoot 45% from 3-point range, then that's a wave that I think you're going to get on the floor a little bit more. But even like Warwick, that's what Warwick shot, and they still they only found him 79 threes last year. I think. You got a guy who's going to shoot 45%. I would want him shooting 130 threes versus 79. So Warwick played for those who are wondering 32.6% of the minutes. His offensive rating was 133.1.
Which is fantastic.
That's great. That was the best on the team. It was. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Going through best on the team. Beat out Caleb Grill by 0.9 points.
And Warwick is a good example of what we were talking about earlier, because I think his usage at Northern Kentucky was about 26%, and that dropped down to 20%, give or take. It was 19-20, I think, if I remember right, at Mizzou this year. So you just took away his bad shots and let him do things that he does well. Now, granted, he shot better from 3 than he had previously, but how much of that is because he wasn't taking tough pull-ups out of pick and roll actions like he did at Northern Kentucky, whereas at Mizzou, he's catching in rhythm. It's a whole different dynamic. It's not just what the shots are, it's how you get them, So I think that'll be a big thing with Stone, and how well he kind of embraces being a role player as well, because he's not going to be the guy unless some things go wrong on Mizzou's team. We haven't gotten into the roster too much, but Mizzou has a lot of guys that are the guy as far as scoring with the ball in their hands. They need some complementary players, and I think that's what they were looking for in this last spot, and managed to find another guy who was used to being the guy. So, that's kind of going to be a overarching theme that we talk about this summer and leading up to the season is like, do they have enough complementary pieces, and how well do all those ball dominant guys play well together? So. Anyway, that's the only last thing I had on Jaden Stone.
So we're at 14 out of 15 roster spots taking up. I still think it's possible to add one more, but it's very likely at this point to be, a 15th guy. I think so. The transfers that were added: Javon Porter, combo forward, sort of 4-man. Loyal and Marymount Mizzou fans are pretty familiar with the Porters. Sean Phillips, your favorite, 7-foot post guy, a little bit more mobile than Josh Gray, a little bit more athletic. Jaden Stone, and then we get to Sebastian Mack, who I think we're all very excited about. A guy that like one of the things I think it was you sort of said it, or was it Harris? It was just like, if he makes 10 more threes,
Yeah,
then
it's something I've said several times regarding guys this summer that, when you look at their 3-point average, and his was around 31%, but he didn't take a lot of threes. I mean, is he a good shooter? We'll find out. But, it's like if he made 10 more threes last year and shot like 38%, I mean, he's a hot commodity this past spring. And that's how silly the spring portal season is. A lot of it is correct in how players are valued. But when I see some of these guys like Desmond Claude, for example, very similar player to Sebastian Mack, just a year older, got what, $2.5 million, or that's what he's asking for. It's like, why? Why is one guy that much and the other guy who's admittedly not quite as good, but again, a year younger? What is the price discrepancy there? And it's not the shooting in that case, because they both were low 30s. But if a guy just makes a couple more shots here and there, the dynamic changes considerably about who's interested.
Yeah, and that's something that the staff has sort of proven that they can do is work with guys and sort of make some tweaks and get them. I think, provided it's not requiring a gigantic overhaul of their shooting stroke. Somebody like you might point that out. Somebody like Mark Mitchell, like that thing. Whereas Mac, like, I think the ball comes off his hand okay. I think why he misses more shots is his feet are a little bit of a mess. And obviously shots begin with a good base. Just ask Steph Curry; he'll tell you that. Always kind of having your lower body, your feet right. And also kind of making sure you're picking and choosing the correct shots. Like if you're not a Steph Curry, knowing that you're taking smarter, better shots, the kind of shots that you're going to make. And, like, to Mac's credit, he's a guy who, playing in the Mick Cronin offense is not necessarily something that a lot of offensive-minded people are going to the tape on. So he's not really getting a lot of the kind of looks that I think he can get, with Dennis Gase kind of steering the show. So that's a addition that I think we're kind of pumped about, at least potentially. And then Luke Northweather, who, I know that there's a lot of sort of casual rolling of the eyes and the former Blair Oaks product. I think it's good. You bring a guy home, he wants to be home. He's okay, being a back end of the rotation type. He's played in the SEC. He's shown he can stretch the floor and be a ball mover. He's not, if he's starting, then I think there's a problem. But I don't think that that's the expectation, is that he's going to sort of come into that role. Then moving on to the rest of the roster, obviously Jacob Cruz is back. Mark Mitchell's back. Trent Pierce is back. Ant Robinson is back. Honor Boateng, T.O. Barrett, and Trent Burns all returned from the freshman class. And then the incoming freshmen are Nicholas Randall and Aaron Rowe. So we're pretty much set, other than, maybe a 15th flyer coming in at some point over the summer. Overall thoughts on the construction of this roster. Are you happy with how things played out? Or do you think that there was a failure in the portal season to properly identify the right guys and needs?
That's
I'm teeing you up here a little bit.
That's a good question. One that I probably can't answer in a limited segment of podcast time. But, I think the roster 1 through 14 is in good shape. I'll say that. I do think the portal season kind of ended up being shuffling the chairs a little bit, as opposed to making a step forward. Sebastian Mack, I think, is a step forward. Javon Porter, even though he has his limitations, I think that's a step forward based on where Mizzou is at up front. But the other guys, like Luke Northweather, when I think of him, I think of the Florida game when Mizzou was without Mark Mitchell, Josh Gray fouled out, and I don't remember who else was in foul trouble, but Mizzou was effectively playing 5 guards against 3 big men and had no chance. And that's why they eventually lost the game despite other things happening. That's a situation where he could help. Other than that, I don't really see a whole lot of involvement. But, as a whole, I think the top 2 additions were good and helpful. And the other 3 were just kind of moving chairs around. Peyton Marshall went out. Sean Phillips came in. Phillips is probably a little bit better, but I see it similar to the thing last year with Butler leaving and Gray coming in. Yes, he's a little bit better now, but you're losing any long-term potential. Marcus Allen leaves. You get Jaden Stone, same situation. Stone's probably a little bit better now. Allen's better longer term. And then, of course, Aiden Shaw, who we shouldn't gloss over since he was here for 3 years and did some good things. But, it seems like they strengthened it a little bit, but, maybe left a little bit on the table as far as what they were able to do this portal season. But, that aside, I think the roster's in good shape. I was looking at this the other day, and depending on what happens with Alex Condon, Mizzou should have the most returning production coming back from last year to next year in the SEC, which that's no small feat. Looking historically the last few years, if you're wanting to be an elite team, you got to be near the top in that metric. You don't have to be, it doesn't guarantee you're going to be elite. But if you want to be one of those elite teams, you're not going to do it by churning the entire roster and bringing in a portal class. Kentucky this past year was pretty much the closest to that, and still they were a clear step behind from the front runners. So, the SEC is losing a lot. Mizzou's retaining more than most. They've got 2 players who grade out really well. They've got 2 guys who are pretty good role players and 3 intriguing freshmen coming back. That's not nothing. This is by far the most Dennis Gates has ever had returning to one of his rosters, and he's got some proven talent. They're not perfect, but they're close. You may have a good case for Haw. Is that how you say his name? From Florida, Thomas Haw.
Yeah.
Hauk. That's it.
Hauk.
And Alex Condon.
I think we should just mispronounce it.
I'm going to call him Haw from now on.
Hoff.
Haw.
Like cough.
But you can make a pretty good case for those 2 guys being the best players. But, Mark Mitchell's right there with those guys as far as being the best returning player. And there's something to be said for that, because usually the best guys next year were the best guys in the conference the past year that stayed over. So occasionally you'll see a transfer jump up in there, but there's a lot to be said for retention, a lot to be said for improving year over year. And, Mark Mitchell, production value-wise, wasn't all that dissimilar from Duke, which is still a very good player. So I think he has some room to improve as well, and how he's able to do that from year 1 to year 2. And the Dennis Gates era will definitely play a part. But overall, I think they've done a good job. I don't know that they've done enough to be considered the favorite. I do think they've done enough to be considered a pretty solid tournament prospect going in, and how these younger guys develop, how Trent Pierce, Jacob Cruz take a step from what they did last year. If those things are all answered in the right way, they could be really, really good. So we'll see. That's a long-winded answer.
Yeah, I think, with Mitchell, obviously, when you're talking about returning production, you're mainly looking at what Mitchell and Ant Robinson can provide. Does Ant have another gear? And can Mitchell find the consistency button? We've seen him be awesome, and I think, I think one of the things they're going to try to do this offseason is to unlock, the shooting a little bit more, make him a little bit more of a threat. We've always said he doesn't need to be a guy who's, going to shoot 40%, but you need to at least be worried about him. And there were a lot of times last year where opponents just weren't worried at all that, if he was going to shoot, they were going to let him shoot and take the odds. And most of the time, Mark, didn't rise to the challenge. Obviously, big shot against Kansas. He did make some threes throughout the season. He didn't go over anything like that. But for him, it's going to be, consistency. Are we going to see, the Mark Mitchell who went for 22 against Kentucky, went for 31 against Alabama, went for 36 against Oklahoma? Are we going to see the guy that sort of disappeared and only chipped in 6 against Ole Miss? Only chipped in 7 at Mississippi State. That guy, he seemed to kind of find more consistency once Dennis sort of challenged him. But we've got to find that at the start of the season, that he's got to carry that sort of that mentality, that that ability that he has to sort of dominate a game athletically, from start to finish. And I think if he's going to do that, he's probably going to be one of the 5 best players in the conference. And if you have, a top 5 player and Ant, if he can be a top 10 player, then I don't like you're a lock for an NCAA tournament bid at that point. And what you're probably talking about is can they contend for a top 4 finish? And I think when we're looking at the construction of this roster, that's where I want to kind of see them take another step and and contend not just for NCAA tournament berths, but actually be a threat in conference. And it's one thing that I think we've kind of talked about a lot is, we already know that Missouri is probably going to be undervalued going into the preseason picks by national media. We're already seeing it in these preseason top 25, not even preseason, off-season top 25. Missouri's an afterthought for most people. I think what CJ Moore and people that really study the game are going to look at the returning production and say, we need to look at a team that was the 19th best team in the country last year, according to Kim Pum, returning a lot more production than a lot of other teams are, and at least think that they're going to kind of hold the line a bit. And I think that's what another good season is important for Missouri, but also for them to continue to make progress towards taking a step from being a 6 seed and a top 8 finish to being a 4 seed and top 4 finish. And I think that's kind of the area where where we're going to need to see in the next year, next 2 years, next 3 years, what Dennis Gates is doing to sort of grow the program and the image of the program, which I think sort of lost some momentum at the end of the year as far as what people thought of Missouri basketball.
Yeah, I do think the finish plays into that, but I also think there's probably still some lingering doubts about 2 years ago, the 0 for 19. What is Dennis Gates at Mizzou? I think he's a good coach, but there's no getting around the fact that he went 0 and 19 in conference 2 years ago, and the reasons for that are many, but are not really considered during these conversations when we're talking about injuries to a guy who is, if not an All-American, close, and John Tonje, a really good player, Caleb Grill. And the one we hardly ever talk about is Connor Vanover, who, people have their own opinions of him, but he's a solid player and still only played, I think, about 8-10 minutes a game and missed huge chunks of time for God knows what reasons. But it just was never there that year. And, as I look back through this historical data, Mizzou had no business going 0 and 19 2 years ago. They were too good for that on an individual level, yet they still managed to do it. So I think there's some lingering questions about that. And then also 10 years ago, if all of these teams were bringing in the same pieces they had now, Mizzou would be considered one of the favorites because they're returning guys who were good at their team. That's not how people think about roster construction anymore. It's what are the shiny pieces that you acquired in the spring? Which there's some truth to that. But look at the teams last year in the Final Four. Florida, they brought in Ruben Chinyelu, who is a solid role player for them, and Elijah Martin. That was their roster or their spring portal haul. You look at Houston, they brought in one player, Milos Uzan, one guy. Auburn, they brought in Miles Kelly. He was the only transfer who really had any effect on their season last year. Who am I missing? Duke. Well, they're a completely different story. They brought in several decent transfers, but it was all freshmen, so they're not a typical case. But when you look at 3 of the 4 teams in the Final Four, they brought in effectively one guy and maybe a role guy in the portal and brought everything back and got them better. Even despite that, we're still talking in the spring like, oh, well, they had the best portal class, so they're going to be the best team next year. That may be true. I mean, you look at Kentucky, they had the best portal class last spring. They were top 5, top 6, finished right ahead of Mizzou in the league standings. But who finished ahead of them? A bunch of teams who brought a bunch of guys back. And yet we still don't think about it that way, like it's unimportant and we know their faults and that these guys don't get any better. They're just the same guy with the same issues last year coming back this year. That's not how it works in reality, but that's how we think about it.
Well, and I'd also add in that I think, like the common thought of, we've got a really good portal class. We're going to be the best team. I think what you do when you rely heavily on transfers is you're going to swing wildly in variance. But I think more than anything, it does put more of a cap on how good you can be. Especially when you're talking about experienced transfer guys who have proven to be one thing over the years. And I think this is one of the reasons why I think you and myself and Matt Harris have all been like, let's recruit, retain, develop. Like that's the path. Because you look at like all the teams that had heavily big time portal classes, and they were all good, but or at least in the SEC. But teams like Ole Miss had a lot of guys in the portal. Kentucky is another good example. Kentucky,
Vanderbilt. Those are the top 3. Yeah.
What's that?
I said in Vanderbilt they had a really good portal class too. Same situation.
And they were good, but they weren't great.
Right.
And
Mizzou had a really good portal class last year. They didn't bring back a whole lot of production. They brought in a top 5 recruiting class and a top 5 portal class, and they were a really good team last year. But no one's going to confuse them for great. They went 10-8 in a really good league. They lost in the first round.
But also, like, who are their best players? Guys who were transfers,
right?
But were there for multiple years. Tamar Bates, Caleb Grill, Ant Robinson, 2-year sophomore. Yeah. Trent Pierce,
Mark Mitchell, of course, but yes, for the most part.
like Mark Mitchell. But if you're going through like all these guys, like Mark Mitchell is like the exception,
right?
He's also a guy who is like, when he hit the portal, everybody was like, whoa, like former 5-star guy just went to the portal. We didn't really have those guys this year.
Yeah, and I think I remember with Mitchell,
like PJ Haggerty.
Out of the like 800 plus transfers that have come into high major conferences the last 3 years, he was top 40 in production first year, and he was good. I mean, I'm not saying anything negative about him. He was really good. But when you're talking about him being top 40 in something out over 3 years, and then you've got guys like Janai Broom, Zakai Ziegler, those sorts who are still ahead of him. Well, they've been there. They've been in their program for a while, and they get better year in, year out. Broom was a transfer, but this was his 3rd year at Auburn. Is he even a transfer anymore in this day and age when you're at a 3rd year at the same program? So to me, it's a difference between first-year transfers and multi-year transfers when you get further down the road. And we're going to see that with Mark this coming year, and we'll see if that pays off.
I was looking back over my SEC transfer tracker because and we'll get it more into like what's going on with the rest of the league. But there's been a lot of turnover.
It's going to be a lot to go through this summer.
A lot of turnover, a lot of lost production, and a lot of guys graduating.
Fifth years are gone.
63 outbound transfers by my count. We're going to see a completely different league, and there's a lot of teams that are already relying heavily on the transfer portal. Today, Mississippi State got Josh Hubbard back, and that is one of those things like we all kind of knew Hubbard was coming back, right? Like, I don't think
he's not playing.
Anybody was convinced that like a 5'10" shooting guard was really gonna be a top 60 pick. But Hubbard is extremely valuable for Mississippi State and Chris Jans, and the difference between a roster that with him looks all right. I think I just bit my cheek there. But there's nobody in here that you're just like, oh wow, they got Jaden Epps from Georgetown. Achor could be decent for them. Amir Ali could be all right. But Hubbard is the guy that is going to be the difference maker for them. Kentucky added a lot of nice players. Obviously, we know Jaden Quaintance. We think his ceiling as a player, but he's also a guy who's, he's going to be on the shelf for 5 or 6 months. They got Denzel Aberdeen, I think is a good player. They got Mo Diabate. I love Mo Diabate as a player, but he's just a good player. He's a guy that I think is important on a roster like Alabama because he's going to do a lot of the things that you're not going to get LeBaron Philon or Aiden Holloway these guys to do.
He's an elite role player.
He's going to defend. He's going to rebound. He's going to take charges. So I actually really like that pickup. So Cam Williams has a high ceiling transfer from Tulane. Jalen Lowe, if you can get his sort of efficiency, is a guy who I think could be really good for them. But the most important thing for them is Otega Owe, if he's coming back. That's important. Colin Chandler taking another step. What are you going to get out of a bunch of freshmen, none of which are super high 5 stars? Jasper Johnson is their highest rated guy. He's currently ranked 20th. So it's all these things, the way that Kentucky is going to be better is because Owe is going to very likely to come back. I don't think he's announced his intention yet. Owe, Garrison maybe taking another step as a player. And Kentucky is always going to be Kentucky, but for one of the reasons why I think Missouri is going to be overlooked is, is you're going to look at their transfer class and be like, oh, okay, it's Sebastian Mack. They got Javon Porter. But we're also excited about what kind of ceiling can Ant Robinson show? Ant Robinson, when he was on the floor, impacted winning just as much as anybody in the SEC. Trent Pierce, when he was playing well, was as valuable in that rotation as anybody else that Missouri had last year. Can you get that consistency? So there's certainly a lot of questions for the Tigers, but I don't know. It's wild to me how much turnover the SEC is seeing how unrecognizable all these rosters are going to be, and I think Missouri has a chance to take that next step forward. As a program, hopefully they do.
Yeah, two things on the turnover. I think the SEC is losing approximately 80% of its production from last year, so that's a lot. And second of all, depending on what happens with Carter Knox and Aduthiero at Arkansas, theoretically, mind you, a John Calipari coach team could have the third most returning production if NBA decisions go their way. Just let that set in. John Calipari could have the third most returning production of any SEC program this offseason. And it's not because he's bringing back a ton. I mean, he could bring back some pretty good players, but it's stark, how many guys are gone. You think of a good player from another team last year, they're probably gone. It's crazy. It really is. I think the top 15 guys, like 13 of them are gone. And then of the top 50, it's like 37, 38, something like that. I mean, it's just all the good players that you're used to seeing this year, the year prior, they're gone. It's a complete changing of the guard as to the individuals who are going to make up this league. It's not Zakai Ziegler. It's not Janai Broom. Whoever else you want to mention, Will Richard at Florida, Walter Clayton, those guys who were there for 2+ years, they're all gone. It's crazy when you actually sit down and look at it.
So we're going to wrap up soon, and I want to kind of hit on some notes of interest. I don't know. I really don't know how many people actually listen to this podcast as a news source. If you are, then I'm surprised. I'm sure that there are better news sources out there, and certainly Rock and Plus forums, good conversation and up-to-date information. However, on the recruiting front, J.J. Andrews was arguably Missouri's top target in the 2026 recruiting class. He is off the board to Arkansas. A little bit of a gut punch. Missouri thought that they were doing really well there. For all the information that we sort of have on it, Missouri was the leader, and everybody thought they were the leader. But the thing about John Calipari is John Calipari had to decide if he really wanted J.J. Andrews. And I think he decided within the last 2-3 weeks, whenever it was, that they did really want J.J. Andrews. And when that decision was made, the rest was sort of written. And so Andrews is off the board. It does sort of hurt Missouri's class. It goes to your conference rival. And certainly, a guy that you invest a lot of time and energy into. Who knows? Maybe hits the portal in a couple of years, and and you can get him on the rebound. But for now, Missouri is shifting gears. Aiden Chronister is probably the top remaining target on the wing. He's another Arkansas kid, but he's 80th or something in the top 247.
He's a little bit further down, yeah.
Yeah, so not a guy
you're talking to the wrong Matt about all this. I understand it a little bit, but our resident prep guy is off gallivanting through the Swiss slopes. So
yeah, he's climbing the Alps. So we should pull up a picture of the image that he sent earlier. He's like, this is the Airbnb. It's like, get out of here, dude. But yeah, Aiden Chronister, they're still recruiting. The idea here is they're going to take a wing and probably one or two big men. Any guards that pop. I think Tony Bryant has a scheduled visit. He's like a top 15 5-star kid. That seems like a long road to haul because he's also not committing until next spring. But certainly, losing Andrews is a hit. However, there's a lot still to go, and
it's better now than
like we'll all forget about JJ Andrews when Honor Batang is dunking on the Hogs, this offseason. And the first non-conference game was announced. Missouri is going to open the season on the road at Howard. It's certainly not a quad 4 home game, so that's good. And playing a game in DC, I guess, can be fun if there's any Mizzou alumni chapters in the nation's capital. But certainly not something that I think either of us expected. It is going to be kind of fun to. I like it when big high major teams go and play mid and low majors on the road. I think it should happen. I think every team should be required to do it at least once a year. I don't care about your gate. I want entertaining games, and even if it causes a loss, I'm for those kinds of games. So those are all the notes that I have.
Yeah, I'm with you on that. I like playing in home arenas no matter where they are. Just play in the arenas that people paid for to host these games. Just do it.
So this is what Matt sent us earlier today of the view from his Airbnb. So if you're watching on YouTube here, you can see it. If you are listening to this through the regular podcast feed, just go to Matt's Twitter feed. I think he put it on Twitter also.
Yeah, the other Matt. Don't come to my Twitter feed. You'll be sorely disappointed.
Yeah. So that's what he's doing while we're stuck here in Missouri talking about basketball. A little jealous, but with that, we're going to get out of here. Watkins, anything else you want to hit on before we get?
Nope. It's officially the off season now, so we won't be gone. But the numbers crunching takes a different appearance now. It's looking forward as opposed to looking back, which is exciting, But it also means that there's nothing that's really happening outside of prep recruiting, which, again, assuming no unfortunate accidents happen on a hike, we'll have you covered there with Harris's prodigious film breakdowns on the prep front. But it's kind of that off season for Mizzou sports, golf and baseball season. Not Mizzou baseball season. That's over too. The professional baseball, and I guess all the other colleges in America are still playing except Mizzou.
You lost me with the golf. Yeah. And baseball. I don't really watch baseball either. This is my off season. I will kind of tune into the NBA playoffs here and there. But other than that, I don't watch really any sports until college football ramps up. A little soccer. I'll check out City and watch some EPL still.
I do miss
they're almost done too.
The summer tones of Dan McLaughlin. I still haven't got quite on board with is it Chip or Skip, whatever Carey.
One of the Careys.
The Cardinals games. Yeah, I still miss Dan with his personal demons and all, but that was the sound of summer with the hot weather outside, just chilling out with the baseball game on in the background. That's the good times.
All right. I'll leave that to you. I will try to get caught up on the shows. So thanks everybody for tuning in. If you did enjoy this podcast, probably make sure that you're subscribed. You can do that on the podcast feed, wherever you download and listen to your podcast. That's Apple Podcasts, Google Play Store. If you are subscribed, you also get episodes of Before the Box Score and Majority Rules, and any new podcasts that we might come up with here in the future. I do think there may be more coming. So with that being said, we'll see you on the forums. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and we'll talk to you in a few weeks. Bye-bye.